Imagine disfiguring your body just to please a man. Deliberately, crippled to conform to male ideals of beauty? Different standards of beauty have always existed in various cultures. For instance, the Mayans used to sculpt their kids' skulls into cones. After marriage, Japanese ladies used to blacken their teeth. Victorian women made their waists as small as the middle finger, and nothing was more admired in imperial China than a woman with little feet. Why would anyone ever do such a thing? Well, in a word, the answer is to appease men. What exactly are bound feet, and why did they become such an enduring part of the Chinese world? When and where did the practice of foot binding begin? Well, today we're going to take a look at some disturbing facts about the history of Chinese foot binding that was done to make men happy. This is History Rediscovered. To support, please subscribe. For around 10 centuries, Chinese women were subjected to a process whereby their feet were routinely crushed and molded from a young age so that they resembled hooves. Foot binding, a custom from China's distant past, gradually came to represent the nation's backwardness. However, foot binding lasted well into the 20th century despite the efforts of reformers. The first recorded binding occurred in the 5 dynasties and 10 states period in the 10th century. An emperor had a favorite concubine, a dancer who built a gilded stage in the shape of a lotus flower. When she bound her feet into a hoof-like shape and danced on the lotus, the practice became very fashionable. After all, she was the emperor's favorite concubine, and the other concubines attempted to imitate her in order to gain the emperor's favor. Upper-class women, hoping to attract the attention of an emperor themselves, started binding their own feet to make them smaller. As a result, foot binding began in the royal court and later expanded over the entire country of China, first in the south and then swiftly up to the north. Every female who wished to get married had her feet bound during the early Qing dynasty, about the middle of the 17th century. By the 12th century, foot binding had increased significantly in frequency. Only severely poor Hakka people and women who worked in the fishing business did not tie their feet since they needed ordinary feet to balance on boats. Unfortunately for women, the process, which was meant to alter the shape and size of the foot, was, as you might imagine, was both lengthy and extremely painful. It limited the mobility of women who underwent it and resulted in disabilities. It usually started when a girl was young. They would have their feet bound between the ages of 4 and 6. Any younger, the girls couldn't endure the pain, and by the time they were older than 6, their feet had already grown too large. 4 to 6 was the ideal age because you could reason with the girls and help them deal with the pain. At that age, the girls' bones are still composed of pre-bone cartilage and were easier to break and mold. The practice usually started during the winter when the feet were more likely to be numb. It would occur in a ritualistic ceremony accompanied by other traditions intending to ward off bad luck. It started with the feet being immersed in either warm water, a herbal and nut combination, or animal blood. The process involved bending the girls' toes underneath the sole and wrapping their feet all the way up to the ankle with extremely long ribbons. All of the girls' toes except the largest were then shattered. In essence, the plan was to repeatedly break the foot anytime it became too big, which typically took 2 to 3 years. The girl's feet would then be shackled for the remainder of her life. The feet were unbound, properly washed, and groomed every 2 days. The soles of the girls' feet might be hammered or kneaded while they were unwrapped in order to soften them and increase joint flexibility. The wrapping was then reapplied to the feet, getting progressively tighter each time. Depending on the age, the process's specifics could also change significantly. Naturally, the girls began to walk in an odd way, almost as if they had hooves. Women with bound feet also developed powerful muscles in their hips, thighs, and buttocks to help them move around more easily. In fact, these physical traits were thought to be physically appealing by the Chinese males of the time. You might be wondering why anyone would undergo foot binding if it was so painful and caused lifelong difficulties. First, because foot binding began in the upper classes, it became associated with aristocracy and a status symbol. They were regarded as the height of female attractiveness and desirableness. Secondly, the practice made the women's thigh and pelvic muscles tighter, which gave the men who had access to them more pleasure during intimate encounters. It was thought that the inner thigh and pelvic muscles grew especially tight as a result of the crippled feet, forcing one to walk in a particular mincing manner to prevent falling down. Accordingly, more obscene theories went: the stronger the vaginal muscles would be during lovemaking, the smaller the bound feet. Thirdly, a girl with bound feet who misplaced her shoe is the subject of the narrative of Yi Xian tale, which was written in the Tang dynasty around 850 CE. The only foot small enough to fit into it is hers, which is how the monarch eventually recognizes her. They marry after falling in love with one another. This story is comparable to the Cinderella tale. Because of this, for families with girls who could be married, foot size served as a type of currency and a way to advance in society. The most coveted bride had a 3-inch foot that was referred to as a golden lotus. 4-inch feet were considered acceptable, or silver lotuses, whereas feet that were 5 inches or more were regarded as iron lotuses. Such a girl's chances of getting married were extremely slim. Also, foot binding persisted for so long because it had a clear economic justification. It was a way to ensure that young girls sat still and helped make goods like yarn, cloth, mats, shoes, and fishing nets that families depended upon for income, even if the girls themselves were tasked with doing the work. Girls who had their feet bound didn't lead a life of idle beauty but rather served a crucial economic purpose, especially in the countryside, where girls as young as 7 weaved. Foot binding as a practice resulted in a number of physiological implications for the women who bound their feet. The binding of feet did not only result in pain and deformities of the feet but also deformities that encompassed the entire body as a result of the practice. A woman's balance, mobility, and posture would all be significantly impacted by having shackled feet. Foot binding made it difficult for a woman to balance and walk correctly, which led to the forward curvature of the lumbar vertebrae. Bound feet caused the lower body to bear more of the weight, which put strain on the pelvis and caused pelvic pain. Chinese females who began the practice at such a young age experienced problems with balance and walking, which stunted bone growth and prevented proper development. Women who had their feet tied found it extremely difficult to bend over or squat, as well as to get up from a seated posture, putting them at risk of falling and hurting themselves. One of the most frequent side effects of foot binding was infection of the feet. Even though the ladies who carried out the ritual were instructed to religiously clean and care for their feet and wrappings, it was nevertheless normal for their feet to continue growing until they reached adulthood. The result was twisted and malformed toes and feet. Lotus feet started to lose popularity during the Qing dynasty, when China was starting to be colonized by Westerners, and Western missionaries and Chinese feminists began to urge an end to foot binding. When the Qing dynasty was established in Manchuria, the Manchurian emperors drafted a number of laws against foot binding, but in 1874, the new regulations were not very effective. A British clergyman organized the first anti-foot binding committee in Shanghai following the end of the Qing dynasty. The Republican administration made repeated attempts to end foot binding, including fining women who continued to have their feet bound after 1915. The People's Republic of China eventually abolished foot binding as Western fashion began to have an increasing impact on China in the early 20th century.